Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out the Death Korps of Krieg. This is the next part in Arch's definitive lore series on the unit, and it is extensive. So let's get into it. But before we do, check below for the links to my second channel where I react to all different kinds of video game and just generic fun content, my podcast on the UFC and mixed martial arts that I run with my brother, and of course my Instagram and my Twitch account where I sometimes stream. All right, and the most important one, the merch store. Check out the merch. Lots of fun parody Warhammer 40k shirts. Be sure to check it out, and it's the best way to support the channel. Okay, having done all that, let's get into it.
Imperium's protection, and potentially some help in, well, fixing that hellhole of a planet. There was nothing, or wait, there might be something. Krieg had been at war for 500 years. The society that breeds was, unsurprisingly, rather militaristic. And that military had been at war for 500 years in some of the most hellish conditions imaginable. And the Imperium does always need soldiers. The Adeptus Administratum levied upon Krieg the highest manpower tithe possible, and so, officially, the Death Korps of Krieg was born, although unofficially they'd called themselves that already for quite a while during their lengthy civil war. But the Administratum is not completely without heart, just mostly. And so they decided that at the very least they should let Krieg start out a little slow. Their society was in ruins. Well, hell, even that would be considered a very charitable interpretation of Krieg's current situation. And so they wanted to give them a little bit of time to gather themselves up, to start rebuilding a little bit. And so, for starters, the Adeptus Administratum requested that the Departamento Munitorum request a single regiment of Imperial Guard to be raised.
So, okay, I just want to point this out. There's this myth that fighting for a long time will make a society better warriors. And in my experience, that and the best research I've been able to find is that is not really the case. Oddly enough, there's something weird that happens on a societal level, right? An individual, of course, a career soldier who spent their entire lives training will, of course, be superior to a conscript that hasn't, all other things being equal. But on a societal level, it doesn't seem to work like that. A lot of ultra-militarized societies actually don't have, ironically, very strong militaries. We look at the Second World War, right? There were a number of fascist countries, right? Germany had a very strong military, but Italy had an almost comically inept military, and Spain's military was barely competitive against the Republican military, despite the fact that the Francoist Spain had the entire professional military of Spain aligned with it already, so they started with a tremendous advantage and had the advantage of explicit support from other fascist countries, and they were still just an even match for Republican Spain. Or rather, they were obviously slightly superior. They won, but after a pretty brutal, long civil war. So it's interesting then to think that after 500 years of continuous warfare, that the society would produce superior warriors. In fact, what seems to happen is that war seems to select for the wrong things. Because you have to think, right? Where do your bravest, most skilled warriors go? Well, they generally go on your most high-risk missions. So what you end up doing is that there is like a sweet spot where you have a certain pace or a brief period of conflict in which you raise up a generation of warriors, you give them experience, you train them, you refine your processes, but then you need periods of peace to sort of grow and develop and implement the lessons that your warrior class learned in the previous conflict. And then you refine your methods, you test them again, you go back to the drawing board, and that continuous back and forth seems to be a more effective method to building a combat-ready military than non-stop continuous warfare. And it sort of makes a lot of sense. You look at, for example, the Kurdish military, right? There is a fanatically devoted group of people who have been in basically nonstop warfare for close to 20 years now, and their military is not actually that strong, right? They are fierce fighters and highly skilled, but the fact is that war does more to bleed a military than it does to build a military. So again, if the Kurds were able to have, say, 20 years of peace where they could grow economically and then equip their military, then I suspect they would be incredibly powerful if Turkey would ever tolerate such a thing. And that would be because, of course, you would have this core group of combat-tested Kurdish soldiers, right? They have an organization to their military that is highly effective, a command structure, a operations process that's really effective, really combat tested. Now it just needs time to build itself out, technology, resources, and of course the ability to not kill off its best soldiers. So in fact, I suspect that, and Krieg has sort of alluded to this by the fact that there's some rumors that the Kriegsmen are very young. That tends to be what you see over time, right? As societies spend more time in warfare, they recruit less and less desirable recruits, and those recruits receive less and less training, and the resources, the tools they have to do so get poorer and poorer and poorer over time. And so after 500 years, I suspect you would actually have almost comically inept conscripts with almost hilariously broken and crude weapons, when the finest weapons had long been destroyed, the best ammunition long been since fired, right? That is the more likely outcome of a society at war for 500 years.
The officials...
Or, of course, eventually realistically, Krieg would starve to death, right? Their society would become subsistence at best, maybe living underground trying to grow fungus or something, but they wouldn't have the resources or the calories to field an army to send their most productive citizens to engage in something like combat.
Krieg responded by stating that they had already raised, trained, organized, and equipped 20 regiments for immediate deployment. It was also added in a side note that every single one of the commanders of these 20 regiments are requested to be posted in the most hazardous battle zones that the Departamento Militarum could find for them. Now, I consider myself a man of a considerable vocabulary. I flatter myself by supposing that I have a modicum of talent when it comes to painting pictures with words, but even I fall, well, and truly short of the necessary verbiage required to even begin to describe the sheer size, lust, and longing of the Adeptus Administratum's boner upon receiving this reply.
Come on, man. We know that if they were AdMech, they would barely have a functioning penis.
But before one allows the vagaries of Winky Hood to lead one astray, these new regiments had to be tested. It was, of course, entirely possible that the men of Krieg could talk the talk, but could they walk the irradiated walk? It turns out that they could. Beyond the wildest expectations, in fact, of the Departamento Militarum. It turned out that 500 years of warfare had not only bred extraordinarily tough troops with a disregard for personal danger and death that bordered upon the insane, they had also developed an absolutely gargantuan armaments industry deep beneath the ground of their irradiated planet. Krieg was a package deal. Not only could it train and organize extraordinarily tough formations of fighting men, they could arm them as well. Upon hearing this, the Departmentum Minitorum immediately requested that the Adeptus Administratum increase the tithes leveled upon Krieg and turn it into a perfect war world. Additionally, they also lobbied for the introduction of so-called Vita womb birthing technology to be granted to the officials on Krieg. And this was a very, very big thing indeed. The technology of Vita wombs is controversial, shall we say. In an Imperium that values the flesh, the humanity of its subjects more than anything, and in fact that views any form of artificial intelligence to be naturally inclined to wipe out any form of life, having people born entirely from artificial wombs, well, that smacks of, well, tech heresy, honestly.
Yeah, this is sort of interesting. You know, I have a thesis that when the Emperor was first created, his mandate was to defend all of humankind. And that mandate sounded probably really noble 10,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago? 50,000 years ago, more. But the problem that it runs into is when you get so advanced that things start to become transhuman. So if the Emperor's goal is to preserve humanity, right, that would mean that the Emperor explicitly would not want to, has no mandate to protect the Astartes, who are not human beings, right? They do not reproduce sexually. They do not have a human being genetic code. He also would not have a mandate to protect transhuman individuals, say a human being that uploaded their consciousness to a computer, or even a person who, implanted their brain into a robot body, right, or converted their brain into artificial neurons. And I think this may be one of the things that sort of the Imperium runs into problematically, is that it has these human beings, but it considers them sacred and unmodifiable, right? When we all know that, it would be easy, trivially easy, in fact, to say, go into large swaths of human beings' genetic code and turn them into all nulls, depowering the warp at a level that's almost impossibly unbelievable, right? They know that it's a genetic quirk that a tiny number of human beings have, so it would be a trivial matter just to genetically engineer more human beings to have that, or just do it the old way and just selectively breed them, right? Select for the trait, breed them again and again and again until human beings' presence in the warp is diminished to nothing, right? That would be an easy solution. The problem is it's transhumanist, right? You would run against this mandate that I hypothesize exists to never corrupt humanity, right? Never to change the fundamental nature of biological humans en masse. And so this technology, this artificial womb technology, I can see why it would be considered iffy, but I think it's pretty clear when you're making a human using different methods as opposed to creating something that isn't a human being, right? Lab growing a human is not that big a deal. It's sort of, I don't want to say we do the same thing now, right? There's a strong prohibition nowadays on allowing embryos to grow outside of a womb within certain phases. Actually, a lot of what we know about the development of human beings is actually inferred from primates or from scans. We've never actually grown a human being past a certain level of cellular division in the womb, right? The next time we are able to study human development is in live humans is when you have like very, very premature babies born in a NICU. So yeah, I don't think this is tech heresy. The Imperium seems to have this strong guiding principle, and as long as you're not doing extensive genetic engineering, right, engineering them outside the bounds of normal human beings, you're probably okay.
But clearly, the Death Korps soldiers have not suffered any ill effect whatsoever. They remain amongst the most loyal, dedicated, and bloody-minded stubborn of all of the Imperium servants. In fact, when they became available in larger numbers to Imperial commanders, many stalemates that had lasted for decades were broken. Scenarios that would either require the mass expenditure of penal legion troops or the deployment of elite formations like the Adeptus Astartes or the Tempestus stormtroopers were now broken, using nothing but blood, grit, and the sheer determination of the core.
So here's what is interesting to me, is that let's say you actually wanted to, over 500 years, select for the trait of reckless willingness to sacrifice your life. That would be incredibly hard to do. Why? Well, obviously, there's only one way to know for sure that you have a person who has that trait, right? Who has that sort of, all human beings, we have this hardwired impulse against dying, right? But let's say you had this tiny number of people that were willing to do it, right? Willing to sacrifice their lives in combat. The only way to select for them is to have them die. And so I guess you could do it by researching the gene code of the most fanatical self-sacrificers post-mortem, identify what all the genes unique to them and try to find it somehow, or maybe do like brain scans on all troops and then retrospectively look at the ones who sacrificed their lives and try to select for troops with that trait. You could maybe, you have to get into some weird eugenics, right? Some really weird eugenics. And it'd be pretty weird. It would be something that would be, again, out of the 40K universe. But honestly, from everything we've seen about human beings in warfare, there's no way to suppress the instinct for self-preservation. It's so, so, so strong in human beings, right? That's why suppressive fire works. That's why the sound and sensation of bullets pinging near you instinctively forces people into cover, right? And when you gain fire superiority, it's because your enemy's instincts won't let them pop their heads up to return fire. So to suppress those would require a biological level change in the human brain. Maybe you could condition it out if you were training like really young children and you had a really good protocol for it. Like you'd have to simulate them killing themselves again and again from like a really young age. You would have to have no discernible code of ethics. I want to be clear about where this rant is going. This is for people who are abhorrent monsters to do such a thing. But there's no shortage of those in the Imperium for Warhammer 40K.
The writing on the wall was clear indeed. Krieg's future had been decided. Eventually, Krieg was turned into an official Departamento Munitorum war world. This enforced the highest possible level of humanitarian ties upon the planet and also gave it access to the Departamento Munitorum's vast resources. Material started flowing into Krieg at an unprecedented rate, and its output of men and material skyrocketed. To the point that these days, Krieg does not raise Imperial Guard regiments. Krieg raises armies. Now, of course, it wasn't entirely perfect, pretty goddamn close as far as the Munitorum was concerned, but they needed to add in one minor change, that being the commissariat. Now, granted, the Krieg Death Korps had never failed, not once, and their planet, despite being subjected to some of the harshest regulation in the Imperium, never batted so much as an eyelash at it. Yet, the Departamento Munitorum almost felt like this was just a little bit too good to be true. Undoubtedly, many a commissar assigned to the Death Korps figured to themselves that they got really unlucky. Usually, a commissar is required to encourage the formations they're attached to go beyond their duties, to sacrifice in the name of the Emperor. A Death Korps of Krieg commissar needs to instead try and keep them from sacrificing themselves unnecessarily.
That's still one of the funniest parts of lore. I think that's great. Just, yeah, the idea that the Krieg regiments have such a strong culture of suicidality that is where they're at. I say that maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe if you raise every soldier in the exact same way in this like cult of noble sacrifice, that you can convince them to all perform that sacrifice, right? We have like in this day and age, I'm trying to think of the non-demonetizing word, the combatants that wear the exploding vests, right? Those guys are not, they're regular human beings from a variety of walks of life, and yet they can be persuaded, convinced, or indoctrinated or brainwashed to do these things. And so, yeah, maybe it's possible that if you have the exact right culture and the right protocols, you can convince large swaths, armies of people to do the same.
This rather unusual situation means that in the Death Korps, commissars are less political officers and more tactical advisors, trying to rein in the worst excesses of their attached regiments. Death Korps commissars also tend to have a remarkably high rate of casualties. It turns out that if you put somebody whose primary duty is to inspire loyalty and zeal in people, and then getting massively out-zealed by the regular guardsmen they're supposed to be inspiring, that tends to give the commissars a bit of an inferiority complex, leading them to commit greater and even more insane deeds of self-sacrifice and zeal than even the average Krieg's guardsman, in order to try and set some kind of example to them. Another vital role of a commissar entrenched with a Death Korps regiment is diplomacy. Whilst generally speaking, there is always a certain degree of friction expected whenever you place two Imperial Guard regiments from different worlds beside one another, the Death Korps is particularly antagonistic, shall we say. There are very few things about them that don't seem specifically designed to piss off regular people. One, they barely ever take their gas masks off, as they are trained to consider them a second skin. Wearing them at all times isn't technically required, but it is encouraged. Secondly, they are all raised from birth to believe in the cult of sacrifice. Essentially, this is the idea that nothing they could sacrifice for the Emperor could ever possibly be too much, or hell.
Yeah, I could also see the idea that a culture of never ever talking to other regiments, because you really need this like frame, right? This is sort of how cult leaders do it. They have to keep this very tight frame on the relationships of the people stuck in the cult. This is why that cult leaders or people that fall into cults so often are encouraged to or convinced to cut off their families, cut off their friends, even not engage in romantic relationships, or sometimes even have private friendships within the cult, separate from the leader and the designated superiors. And that is to ensure that the only ideas that are in the cult members' minds are those implanted by the cult. Again, a family member who says, hey, I think it's sort of absurd to give all your money to this guru. That idea can spread like wildfire through a cult, right? So you've got to do everything you can to never let those ideas enter and to never let them like come in through routes that people trust. And so for a Krieg guardsman, I imagine that their officers understand that having these soldiers that never ever talk to regular guard who say, hey, I actually think I could survive combat in this deployment, and I don't consider it a personal failure to not survive. I consider that if we survive and the enemy dies, that I have succeeded and honored the Emperor in doing so, right? That idea is so toxic to Krieg culture that they probably work tirelessly to make sure it never enters into the regiment.
Well, even enough, really. You can imagine just how dour a bunch of people the Death Korps are, considering that they have been bombarded with this since their very birth, and considering they've also survived training, in which the casualty rate, even for Krieg natives, is considered a bit appalling. Yeah, they're not exactly the life of the party, to put it mildly. To just add the final little cherry on top, they also nurture a strong disdain to anyone that isn't them. They view basically 96% of the rest of the galaxy as soft weaklings, and, well, in comparison, they certainly do have a point. Basically, if you are not the most rabid form of emperor botherer, they will consider you to not be anywhere near pious enough, and they will tell you so, to your face, loudly and repeatedly. This means that wherever possible, Death Korps regiments should be deployed alongside other Death Korps regiments, which, fortuitously, considering the sheer volume of regiments Krieg produces, is quite often entirely possible. Or alternatively, they should be placed alongside some other band of religious fanatics. They get along famously well with Maccabean Janissaries, for example, or other regiments who are overly fond of strict discipline, like, for example, the Mordian Iron Guard. And now that we've just touched upon the cult of sacrifice a little bit, it's time to talk about it.
That is actually extremely realistic. Units looking down on other units is as old as time itself, and just viewing even units where there's no meaningful difference, like a cav unit and an armored unit. You would think those guys hated each other, right? They think the other ones are idiots. I mean, look at me and all the shit I talk on engineers, even though, frankly, MPs and engineers literally have their schools next to each other.
The cult of sacrifice and the training for the Death Korps. Firstly, what is the cult of sacrifice? Well, it is the idea, as mentioned, that no sacrifice is too great. This is hammered into every single child on Krieg from the very moment they are born. They are told that the great sacrifice made by their forefathers during the nuclear cleansing of their world initiated by Colonel Jurgen was the first great sacrifice that they had to commit to make up for the atrocities committed by the ruling Council of Autarchs, who have been turned into some kind of combination of Satan, Beelzebub, Lucifer, and Hitler. And yes, I know several of those are basically the same thing, but I'm just trying to illustrate just how thick they smeared it on when it comes to the Council of Autarchs. They are literally the worst thing to have ever happened, ever. In fact, your average Krieg's guardsman, if asked, would probably have to vex lyrically about whether or not Horus was really quite as bad as the High Council. And since Krieg was the planet who birthed such an absolute atrocity, there is quite simply no limit to the amount of sacrifice that Krieg should be expected to provide in the Emperor's service.
I'm always curious about that. I wish I read more about the psychology of creating a state and a mindset of guilt. I think this is one of those things, we know that human beings, if you want to get them to make a rational decision, you need to put them into an emotional state. This is what a lot of advertising strives to do. And, it either harkens an emotion or evokes it. And those emotional states, they suppress your ability to engage in critical thinking skills. They make people more impulsive. There's tons of research, right? And this is why usually the worse a financial decision is, the more the person selling it or people selling it rely on emotion, right? And of course, shame is a big one. Anxiety, as we've seen, is a big one, to get people to not think critically. Feeling threatened or attacked. Also, feelings of loyalty, of community, of positivity, right? These are things, especially when you pair them with each other, right? When you offer someone shame or pride, when you offer someone community or isolation, or community or threat, community or danger. These are things that you use to sell people products. The more emotional you get, the more you tie the product into emotion or the action, right? The less that person is going to think critically about whether they really need that product, whether it's the best deal, whether waiting longer or shorter it can do it. This is really common in investments. You can see a lot of scammy investments rely on these, putting people in emotive states, playing on fear, playing on an excited state. This crypto will go to the moon. You'll be a millionaire, right? If you notice, some of these salesmen will actually encourage you to think about an imagined future. Imagine the Lambo you're going to be driving, right? Imagine the look on your parents' faces when you tell them that my shitcoin paid off your mortgage. Your parents will know that their basement-dwelling loser son who trades crypto for a living was really a genius all along. Those fantasies are powerful, and those emotions around them are powerful, and you can get people to do dumb shit when you do it. So it makes sense, of course, that Krieg's cult would emphasize shame intensely. I think shame's a really powerful one.
And
especially the idea that they should feel deep, intense shame all of the time, and that the only way to release that shame is through a perfect, unflinching sacrifice.
Mind you, this is not strictly limited to martial sacrifice. It also involves the quote-unquote civilian population, although there isn't really anyone who could be considered a civilian on Krieg, or at the very least, not in the way that we would normally use the word. You see, the entirety of Krieg society is focused around nothing else but churning out as many guardsmen, as many guns, as many artillery pieces, as many tanks as it is possible. This means that essentially the entire population is engaged in warfare in one way or the other. All of the fit menfolk, and indeed even the non-fit ones, are pretty much universally recruited into the Death Korps of Krieg. Now, of course, there are always the occasional exceptions here and there, but they are few and far between. Meanwhile, the female part of the population, along with the children, mind you, are pretty much all working in the factories. As you can probably imagine, there's not much of a childhood period at all on Krieg. You're working in the factories in one way or another pretty much as soon as you're able to walk on your own. For the male part of the population, this is a brief period of relative safety. Relative, as in there's only so safe you can ever get whilst living on a highly industrialized subterranean hive world where the entirety of the rest of the planet, e.g. anything above ground, is laced with lethal radiation. This, by the way, is pretty much also the only chance they have of escaping a fate in the Death Korps of Krieg. Mind you, most of them don't want to. They have been raised on the ideas of a heroic sacrifice since they were old enough to understand words. Most of them consider the idea of finally being recruited into the Death Korps as an honor, something that they look forward to, something to celebrate when it happens, but if they manage to develop some form of talent or they prove themselves particularly valuable. Let's for example say that you've got a full-on mechanical genius. He has increased the productivity of his workstation by several 100%. He is just incredible at his job. In that case, his overlord might decide that it would be better for the wider war effort for him to remain on Krieg, but these are very, very much so the exceptions rather than the rule.
See, here's sort of, you end up with this incentive problem, right? Let's assume that Krieg successfully instills that the greatest honor you can have is to die, right? To die in the service of the Emperor. So let's say then you are a mechanical genius and you do increase your workstation by 4,000%, or you could. Why would you choose to do so? Why would you choose to engage in self-preservation? And so the answer would have to be, there'd have to be some societally acceptable way for a person to do that, to engage in this sort of behavior, right? You'd have to be acceptable to society that you could be a genius and alive and still consider yourself to be serving the emperor. But you see the conflict here, right? Like, you can't incentivize both. You can't incentivize people you can't praise people who both live and people who die. You have to create a single set of incentives. And because, again, if truly the greatest honor is to die in the emperor's service, then no one would ever want to work in a factory. No one would ever want to improve production. No one would ever want to improve any facet of life on Krieg, right? The best people, the smartest people would understand that they need to get to the regiment, be trained up, and then die. Right? That is the greatest aspiration. So again, you see how these incentives can get kind of goofy, and this is part of the like warrior culture as the be all end all. This is where things get kind of weird. Is that you can't run a society off of this martial culture, right? You need too many other people playing too many other roles, and you have to have a society that rewards them in addition to warriors.
And then, of course, comes the actual training for the Death Korps. If you've been paying even the slightest amount of attention, you will probably have gathered by now that Krieg is not exactly a nice place to grow up. You wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you've got maybe half an hour to chow down some absolutely terrible breakfast, probably consisting of some form of regurgitated, reconstituted, and recycled waste material. After which, it's off to work, which almost invariably takes place in some form of massive industrialized factory complex that never ceases operation. You've got a 12-hour shift, and some sad-ass motherfucker has the 12-hour shift after you. Unless you are fortunate enough to be some form of administratum or departamento munitorum clerk, your job is likely to be noisy, filthy, dangerous, and exhausting. Furthermore, you are fed just enough to maintain maximum productivity and make sure that you don't die, at the very least, not from starvation. And if you are lucky enough to actually receive wages, it's not going to be a whole lot, to put it like that, and even if you did get a lot of money, what the hell is there to spend it on? You are on Krieg. Luxury goods is not exactly at the top of the priority list for the Departamento Munitorum. And yet all of that is going to appear as if nothing more than a pleasant, fluffy dream once you're finally enrolled into the Death Korps of Krieg. Those of you who have been in the army have probably had the pleasure of getting intimately acquainted with a drill sergeant or two. Now, of course, drill sergeants are a part of any functional army, and they tend to be extraordinarily verbose and vicious creatures. Quick to anger and slow to forget, they are the intransigent elephants of any armed forces. Furthermore, they primarily sustain themselves by feeding off the suffering of others. Therefore, it is most fortunate for them that their chosen profession provide them with such an ample supply of fresh-faced recruit to torture.
Okay, he's exaggerating a little bit. Most drill sergeants I know are extremely professional. Professional without exception. Fun fact, I actually technically was enlisted for like 8 months. I went to basic training through the National Guard and then immediately signed a contract with ROTC to pay for my school and get me into the officer corps. But I did complete basic training in, like 2006 in Relax in Jackson, right? Those of you in the military know that's the base that is that trains all the generic MOSs, right? No infantry, no combat arms at all, I think. So anyway, all that to say, the drill sergeants are extremely professional. They're not sadists. They're not there to inflict cruelty. They are there to strictly and regimentally take you through a fixed course of training to instill military discipline and the essential skills to do your military job.
Incidentally, their chosen form of sustenance...
But they aren't especially kind or understanding, right? They're strict. They're disciplinarians.
is also the reason why they seem to always be awake before anybody else. As you can probably imagine, after going several hours without bullying some poor white shield, their monstrous little bellies must be absolutely famished. The point is that
What the hell's a white shield?
the drill sergeant truly is one of God's more heinous creatures, but there is also a soft, quivering pinkness to them. At the end of the day, despite their fondness for pain and suffering, their job is to break you down, so they can build you up better, and some of the fluffiest men I've ever known wear their stripes with pride. The Death Korps also has drill sergeants, but there is one pertinent difference. They have no interest in tearing you down to build you back up. They are of the opinion that if you can be torn down in the first place, then you are simply not Death Korps material. And the best thing they can do, both for you and the Corps, is to break you as quickly as possible. Either fatally, or by sending your, in all due likelihood, crippled ass back to the factory lines. Death Korps training, unsurprisingly, is a bit on the brutal side. It is not necessarily that different from the training doctrines in and of themselves.
Okay, here's the thing. If you, from childhood, are malnourished, engage instead of in normal childhood activities like play, athletics, right? Children seem to have an instinctive desire to use their bodies, right? They want to play on jungle gyms. They want to jump off trees. They want to climb and fall and wrestle. And those things are essential to developing a strong, capable body. And I don't even mean young children, right? I don't mean toddlers, all the way through your teenage years. The U.S. Army actually found that sometime in the mid-2000s that its recruits, right, raised in the era of video games, television, and Lunchables, were actually having this exponential but steady rise in stress-related injuries. These were musculoskeletal injuries caused usually by strain, stress fractures, strained muscles, pulled back pain, knee pain, things that you would expect from someone in maybe their 40s at the end of a career, right? Or someone who had gone through an extremely rigorous course like a special forces selection, right? But instead they were seeing it in young, healthy, normal weight 19-year-olds. And what the Army realized is that unlike the previous generations that had typically arrived in the military, whether they had played organized sports or not, whether they were from an upper class family or a lower class family, they all just spent a lot of time outside. They just did things with their bodies, right? Even if it wasn't necessarily, they weren't necessarily like running backs, or wrestlers in high school, right? But you would screw around with your friends. You'd hop around the bleachers. You'd hop the fence behind the football field, right? You, played tag as a kid and played dodgeball and did all these things. And the military realized that the new generation was raised on TV and video games, and their bodies actually showed it, right? They were, again, a few percentage points every year, but less resilient, less able to handle things. And so badly that the military changed its basic training, and now even the physical training in the larger force to reflect the idea that they're focused now on preventing soldiers from developing stress-related injuries, right, as stress like the biological stress of doing stuff, instead of training them to an elite level. And of course, soldiers on their own individually vary. Soldiers who are fit will put in the work on their own, and the military has ways of encouraging that. But this idea that you can give someone a brutal, malnourished childhood working in a factory, and that you can then take them and raise them into a fit, strong, capable soldier is totally incorrect. It would not happen. Their bodies would be so weak and so broken already that it would be a real struggle to train them. Also, sometimes we think that really malnourished kids, their brains may not actually develop in quite the same way. They're more likely to have learning difficulties and that sort of thing. And so, the idea that the Death Korps would intentionally raise this generation of weakened youths and then could turn them into the Imperium's finest fighting force is probably just incorrect.
Of other regiments, however, the key difference lies in the implementation. Other regiments have mock battles. The Corps has them, but they use live artillery. Other regiments...
Yeah, also, I understand the live fire exposure. I mean, even I did it. I don't know if they still do, where they would shoot live rounds above your head and you kind of like crawl and maneuver. They were well above your head, but the point is to get you acclimated to it and not have you totally freak out. But again, killing good soldiers, if you're training, soldiers that train hard make mistakes. This is the point of training. You push your systems. You get them tired. You get them hungry. You do it in the dark. You do it in the rain. You do it when your radio doesn't work. You push it until your vehicles run out of gas, and you still force your soldiers to go, right? And that is what training does so well, is it inoculates you to survive and thrive and complete the mission in tight circumstances. However, if you kill your untrained or partially trained soldiers that are like you can be a good soldier who isn't trained in a particular task, right? Nobody expects a soldier, even the best soldier in the world, to instinctively know how to work a claymore. So you didn't train them on a live claymore because they'll blow themselves up. Even though they're smart, they're not they can't conjure up knowledge, right? And so this is why when people are like, they're tough, they do live fire exercise, they shoot artillery at each other, real world war games. What are you talking about, guys? This is ridiculous. Actually, okay, so we are right around 45 minutes. So we're gonna pause it there, man. This is an extensive history. Arch is Arch, man. This dude loves his lengthy kind of pontificating videos, but man, there's no better lore expert out there. So thank you guys for watching. Be sure to check out all the links we talked about. Check out the merch store, #1 way to support the channel. And until next time, I will see you guys later.